Chicago's playoff dreams aren't being killed on the field. They are dying in total silence behind closed doors. While fans cheer outside the gates of Halas Hall, a passive-aggressive Cold War between the veteran defensive line and the franchise quarterback is tearing this team apart. If they don't break the silence, this locker room collapse guarantees a disaster before the first real whistle ever blows. This is not just another seasonal slump, nor is it the standard adjustment period of a young offense finding its footing in the summer heat. It is a slow-motion, structural implosion of a franchise that was supposed to finally claim its seat at the head of the NFC table. To understand how Chicago reached this precipice, one must first look at the blinding optimism that defined the early months of the offseason. On paper, the blueprint was flawless. The local headlines were drunk on hype, and national analysts threw around terms like dark horse contender and dynasty in the making with reckless abandon. The narrative was simple and intoxicating. A transformed, explosive offense led by a generational young talent in Caleb Williams, coupled with an already elite, hyper-aggressive defense ready to suffocate divisional rivals. Fantasy rosters were stacked with Chicago skill players, ticket prices hit historic highs, and the overall consensus around Lake Michigan was that the dark years were officially in the rearview mirror. Yet, as the warm summer air settled over Lake Forest, the golden aura surrounding the building began to warp. What was supposed to be a seamless transition into elite contention rapidly turned into an uncomfortable exercise in forced harmony. Those who looked past the highlight reels and paid attention to the blank spaces between reps during voluntary OTAs began to notice a disturbing trend. The energy inside the practice facility wasn't high-octane or competitive, it was icy. The dynamic between the defense and the offense wasn't the iron-sharpening iron environment promised by the coaching staff. It was a cold, deliberate partition. At the center of this quiet crisis is a fundamental breakdown in basic human and tactical communication. In standard NFL environments, OTAs and training camp practices are defined by a constant, chaotic dialogue. Offenses and defenses trade blows, shout back and forth, and exchange the kind of intense, constructive banter that builds trust under stress. When a young play caller makes a mistake, veteran leaders usually pull him aside to explain what coverage disguise baited the throw. When a play succeeds, there are high fives and mutual acknowledgement of a well-executed design. In Chicago, however, the silence has been deafening. During 7-on-7 drills and full-team scrimmages, observers noted that after series ended, the veteran defensive front, anchored by high-priced, high-profile leaders, consistently turned their backs on the offense entirely. There were no midfield exchanges, no teaching moments, and no dynamic dialogue with the young quarterback. When Caleb Williams walked off the field after a drive, the defensive unit formed an isolated circle on the far sideline, operating as if the offense belonged to a completely different organization, or perhaps an unwelcome guest in their house. The passive-aggressive dynamic quickly leaked from the practice turf into the media room. During routine post-practice press availabilities, the microaggressions became impossible to ignore. When reporters repeatedly asked veteran defensive anchor Montez about the development of his young quarterback and how the offense was coming along, the responses were clipped, sterile, and deliberately distant. Sweat consistently bypassed using Caleb Williams' name altogether, referring to the face of the franchise only as the offense, the young guy, or simply number 18. When pressed on whether he had given the young play caller any advice on recognizing pre-snap coverage shifts, the answers were sharp and defensive. The messaging was clear. My job is to rush the passer, not raise a quarterback. This subtle public distancing served a clear purpose. It signaled to the press, the fans, and the rest of the locker room that the defense viewed itself as an elite, self-contained entity that was actively being dragged down by the hype and growing pains of a hyped-up young play caller. By the time the team suited up for preseason action, This emotional and social detachment was no longer just an off-field curiosity. It had begun to directly compromise on-field execution. Preseason games are meant to calibrate pre-snap communication, line adjustments, and situational chemistry. Instead, the footage revealed a team suffering from a total failure of tactical synergy. Late down communication efficiency plummeted during early drive sequences. Line protection calls were met with blank stares or delayed responses from the front seven during cross-unit walkthroughs, directly contributing to broken protections that left the backfield completely exposed to unnecessary hits in exhibition play. The subtle, microscopic details that separate functional football teams from dysfunctional ones were missing. The structural foundation of the season was already showing major stress fractures, proof that long before a team loses on the scoreboard, they lose in the quiet spaces where chemistry is supposed to grow. What began as an unsettling distance between position groups in early summer has rapidly evolved into a rigid, structural divide inside the walls of Halas Hall. In modern professional football, success relies on total organizational integration, a fluid, interdependent ecosystem where defense, offense, and special teams operate under a unified strategic umbrella. In Chicago, however, that ecosystem has ruptured. The locker room is no longer a shared sanctuary. It has split into two distinctly hostile territories, defined by a self-imposed defensive wall that threatens to derail the franchise's ambition before the competitive meat of the season even arrives. At the epicenter of this fracture is a veteran defensive line that has effectively isolated itself from the rest of the roster. Anchored by high-priced pass rusher Montez and veteran interior anchor Grady Jarrett, the front four has established an exclusive clique. This isn't the standard camaraderie of a position group bonding over film review or dinner after practice. It is a calculated defensive posture designed to separate their individual reputations from the uncertain trajectory of an offense helmed by a sophomore signal caller. Observers inside the building note that during open media hours and team functions, the defensive front moves as a singular, impenetrable unit. They occupy separate tables in the dining hall, sit far apart during team-wide meetings, and dismiss any attempts by young offensive players to bridge the gap. This physical isolation is underpinned by a subtle, creeping shift in priority, the quiet emergence of a stat-driven, individualistic culture. In a high-stakes league where contract extensions, incentive thresholds, and Pro Bowl selections dictate long-term security, tension naturally arises when a defense believes it is doing the heavy lifting for an inefficient offense. Whispers around the program suggest that key veteran leaders on the defensive line have increasingly prioritized their individual metrics, specifically sack bonuses, tackle for loss numbers, and quarterback hit incentives over holistic, team-first defensive execution. When a defensive front operates under the mindset that every drive must yield personal stat production rather than complementary team football, the overall scheme breaks down. Instead of playing disciplined, gap-sound run defense or holding rush lanes to allow secondary coverage to work, pass rushers begin freelancing. They jump snap counts, abandon run fits to chase rogue sack opportunities, and play with a mercenary mindset. The overarching logic is as cynical as it is destructive. If the team fails, let the blame fall squarely on the young quarterback, while the defense collects its individual accolades and protects its market value. The collateral damage of this philosophy is felt most acutely on the sidelines during live reps. The collaborative culture that head coach Ben Johnson worked to instill has been replaced by a pervasive silo mentality. In healthy organizations, when a young quarterback throws an interception or misses a read, veteran defensive players are the first to greet him on the bench with words of encouragement, reminding him that they have his back. In Chicago, offensive mistakes are greeted with icy contempt. When Caleb Williams comes off the field, following a stalled drive or a turnover, the reaction from the defensive bench is a study in passive-aggressive posture. Cameras and sideline personnel have caught veterans visibly rolling their eyes, turning their backs, or shaking their heads in theatrical frustration as the offense sits down to review pictures on their tablets. There are no words of advice, no constructive breakdowns of what the opposing defense showed, and zero emotional support. The message transmitted across the sideline is clear and demoralizing. You are wasting our time and you are ruining our season. This emotional distance fundamentally alters how the game is played on the field. An offense forced to operate under the gaze of a hypercritical, unsupportive defense plays with an unhealthy level of anxiety. Play callers become tentative, second-guessing aggressive downfield shots out of fear that a single mistake will invite further scorn from their own locker room. Quarterbacks start rushing their progressions, feeling an artificial pressure to be perfect on every snap because they know their defense will not afford them a margin for error. By allowing this positional schism to fester, Chicago has created an internal dynamic where the biggest opponent isn't sitting on the opposite sideline. The team has allowed ego, contract paranoia, and generational friction to turn teammates into adversaries. The defensive front has drawn a line in the sand, insulating themselves behind their own stats while leaving their young offense to sink or swim alone. In doing so, they have fractured the core trust required to win close games in November and December, proving that a team divided against itself cannot survive the relentless pressure of an NFL regular season. For a young quarterback heralded as the savior of a historic franchise, the NFL transition is already an overwhelming gauntlet of accelerated processing, complex defensive disguises, and immense public scrutiny. When that quarterback is Caleb Williams, a talent carrying the weight of Chicago's decades-long search for elite signal caller play, the pressure is multiplied tenfold. Yet, the most daunting obstacle facing Williams isn't the sophisticated blitz packages dialed up by opposing coordinators. It is the utter isolation he experiences within his own building. Trapped inside an artificial offensive bubble at Halas Hall alongside fellow young targets like Rome Odunze, the face of the franchise finds himself under siege from the very veterans who were supposed to serve as his shield. This isolation is most glaringly revealed during the critical hours spent in the film room, where NFL games are quietly won long before Sunday afternoon. In functional organizations, joint film sessions between offensive and defensive units serve as a masterclass in tactical exchange. Veteran pass rushers and elite defensive linemen routinely break down subtle telltale signs for a young quarterback, explaining how a defensive end sets his stance before a stunt, how a nickel cornerback telegraphs a blitz with his hips, or how pre-snap safety rotation reveals coverage cover-ups. In Chicago, however, leaked reports paint a starkly different picture. Film sessions have been marred by a calculated, silent treatment from veteran defensive anchors. Instead of offering insights, veterans sit in cold silence, withholding the nuanced feedback that helps a young play caller decrypt complex defensive fronts. Deprived of this crucial mentorship, Williams is essentially forced to navigate the field blindfolded during high-speed reps. Rather than making pre-snap reads with confidence, he is left guessing on defensive rotations and edge pressures. When a veteran defensive line refuses to explain how they exploited an offensive tackle's weakness or set up a secondary trap during practice reps, the young quarterback loses invaluable reps of intellectual growth. Every missed opportunity for a teaching moment compounds his developmental drag. Instead of playing instinctively and trusting his natural arm talent, Williams begins overthinking every drop back, second-guessing his eyes, and holding onto the ball a fraction of a second too long, a recipe for disastrous sacks and turnover-worthy plays. This toxic dynamic stands in painful contrast to the historic blueprints that have successfully launched great quarterback careers throughout NFL history. When Patrick Mahomes was sitting behind Alex Smith or absorbing lessons from veteran defensive leaders in Kansas City, he was surrounded by an ecosystem that viewed his growth as the organization's collective duty. When Tom Brady took the reins in New England, veteran defensive legends actively tested, coached, and protected him, recognizing that a confident quarterback was their ultimate ticket to a Super Bowl ring. Legendary franchises understand a fundamental truth. Veteran leadership must act as a catalyst for a young quarterback's ascension, not an ego-driven hurdle designed to protect individual territory. In Chicago, that foundational logic has been completely inverted. By allowing a culture of indifference to flourish, the organization has left its most prized asset to fend for himself against the cold reality of professional football. Williams is not just fighting opposing pass rushes, he is fighting the psychological drag of knowing his own teammates are waiting for him to stumble. On the field, this manifests in subtle but devastating ways. Off-field, it erodes the unshakable confidence that made him a superstar prospect in the first place. As the regular season approaches, Caleb Williams stands as a franchise face under siege, isolated in his own locker room, starved of veteran wisdom and forced to bear the crushing weight of a city's expectations entirely on his own shoulders. When an NFL roster fractures along structural lines, the consequences are never contained inside the facility. The quiet tension that brews during peaceful summer practices metastasizes into catastrophic, visible failure under the unforgiving lights of autumn football. For Chicago, the ultimate price of this internal Cold War won't just be measured in awkward press conferences or passive-aggressive bench posture, it will be paid on the field in live, game-altering disasters. A locker room devoid of fundamental trust creates an environment where failure compounds rapidly. When a defense views its own offense as an enemy or a burden, the tactical margin for error disappears. On third and long situations, when a defense surrenders a late conversion, the immediate reaction isn't a collective reset. It is a wave of lingering resentment that travels back to the sideline. Conversely, when Caleb Williams operates with the knowledge that his own veteran defensive line is actively waiting for him to fail, the psychological drag alters his clock in the pocket. Forced throws, delayed reads, and catastrophic pre-snap miscommunications are the natural, inevitable symptoms of a team playing against itself. In high-stakes moments against disciplined opponents, this friction guarantees avoidable turnovers and late-game collapses. The 2026 calendar offers no sanctuary for a team wrestling with internal dysfunction. The early stretch of the schedule, featuring high-profile physical tests against conference contenders, will mercilessly expose any lack of cohesion. But the true reckoning arrives during the grueling divisional gauntlet. Matchups against NFC North rivals like the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions are built on thin margins, where cross-unit synergy dictates survival. When Chicago travels to Lambeau Field, or steps onto the national stage for Thanksgiving at Ford Field and Christmas Day at Soldier Field, an isolated offensive unit and a rogue defensive front will be torn apart by coaching staffs that excel at exploiting psychological fault lines. Beyond the win-loss column lies the devastating collateral damage to the Chicago brand. General Manager Ryan Poles and head coach Ben Johnson worked meticulously to purge the lingering shadows of past eras, selling a narrative of a modern, player-first culture capable of sustaining long-term championship contention. A public implosion driven by veteran ego and rookie isolation shatters that illusion. It signals to prime free agents that Halas Hall remains a toxic battleground where individual stats outweigh collective titles, and it threatens to prematurely burn out a franchise quarterback before his rookie contract even reaches its midpoint. If this internal warfare is permitted to run its course, the outcome is entirely predictable. A late-season slide, a brutal first-round playoff blowout, or a complete collapse before the postseason even begins. When team leaders prioritize personal bonuses over team chemistry, they guarantee that Chicago's ambitious 2026 window won't close with a fight. It will go up in flames in total, tragic silence. Saving Chicago's season before it collapses into a historic tragedy requires more than routine scheme adjustments or cliched rallying cries. It demands an immediate, ruthless operational intervention at the highest levels of the franchise. Head coach Ben Johnson and general manager Ryan Poles stand at a pivotal crossroads, forced to make a decisive choice between protecting inflated veteran egos or defending the long-term future of their organization. If Halas Hall is to escape this self-inflicted Cold War, the front office must be willing to burn down the positional silos before the trade deadline cements their fate. The first step in this blueprint for survival falls squarely on Ben Johnson's shoulders. A coach known for his tactical sharpness must now exercise absolute cultural authority. The passive-aggressive distancing during film sessions and sideline eye-rolling can no longer be tolerated as harmless veteran posturing. Johnson must institute non-negotiable cross-unit integration, mandating joint film reviews, shared leadership councils, and total accountability for bench decorum. If veteran anchors on the defensive line refuse to actively engage with and support Caleb Williams, their playing time must be directly reduced. In a league governed by tape and leverage, benching a star pass rusher for destructive body language sends an unmistakable signal across the entire facility. No individual stat contract or Pro Bowl resume outweighs the health of the team. If internal enforcement fails to shatter the rift, Ryan Poles must execute a locker room purge. NFL history is filled with cautious front offices that attempted to coddle disruptive veterans, only to watch those same players poison the developmental well of a young quarterback. If high-priced stars like Montez or Grady Jarrett continue to treat the defense as an isolated mercenary unit, Poles must actively shop them before the trade deadline, regardless of dead money penalties or public backlash. Sacrificing a marquee defender is a steep price, but it pales in comparison to the generational cost of permanently breaking Caleb Williams' confidence. Removing toxic elements from the locker room clears the path for young, hungry contributors to step up, re-establishing a culture rooted in collective accountability rather than individual entitlement. Ultimately, this crisis represents a supreme test of organizational philosophy. For decades, Chicago has cycled through talented rosters that succumbed to internal rot, squandering elite championship windows because the front office prioritized individual talent over psychological chemistry. Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson were brought in to break that generational curse. The choice before them is simple and absolute. Intervene aggressively to forge a unified, single-minded football team, or allow internal politics to fracture the locker room and trigger another decade-long rebuild. The clock is ticking and the city is watching.